Good evening to those of you joining us here in person at the Begin Center in Jerusalem, and good evening or good afternoon to those watching on Zoom, wherever you are in the world. We always have a nice international audience watching us virtually. My name is Paul Gross. I'm a senior fellow here at the Begin Center. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to another of our English language programs here. I'm especially happy that we're here to launch the new book of a good friend of the center, a good friend of mine, Gol Kalev. His book is The Assault on Judaism, available on Amazon and also here after the event, for those of you here. This book looks at the subtitle is The Existential Threat is Coming from the West. It's already made quite a splash. It's already an Amazon bestseller and was chosen as the cover for a recent edition of the Jerusalem Report. It's a follow-up to Gal's previous book, Judaism 3.0, Judaism's Transformation to Zionism, which argued that Zionism has become the anchor of Judaism and that therefore, or one of the aspects of that is that anti-Zionism and Israel bashing have become the principal way in which Judaism and Jews are attacked today in the world. And some of you will know that we held a series of events here at the Begin Center related to different aspects of Gal's thesis. We brought in a lot of top speakers, some of whom agreed more or less with Gal, some of whom didn't, and there was a lot of nice back and forth, and I give Gal a lot of credit that he's always happy to be challenged and disagreed with. Just over a year ago, we had one such debate here, which focused on the claim in Gal's first book that anti-Zionism is an existential threat to the survival of Judaism. And in that event, Gal outlined a theoretical path to the destruction of Judaism, as he saw it, which involved sanctions and delegitimization and demonization of Israel coming from the West. And then 3 weeks later, we had October 7th, and we've seen many of these predictions come true, unfortunately. I mean, it might be good for sales of Gal's book, but still, unfortunately. Over the summer, Gal published a new edition of Judaism 3.0, which was updated to include events of the last year. And we're delighted to be launching his new book, The Assault on Judaism, which analyzes the events of the last year in the Western media, in international organizations, in Western governments, in global public opinion, and shows how these events amount, according to Gal, to the greatest survival challenge for the Jewish nation in the last 2,000 years. He shows how this Western assault on Judaism is also becoming a threat to US national security and offers creative new solutions to counter this assault. So we'll hear more from Gal on this, and you can also, of course, ask him more and challenge him in questions later. The book has been lauded by a number of significant voices, including the editor of Newsweek, Josh Hammer, who called it a must-read, Colonel Richard Kemp, I'm sure is known to many of us, a very good friend of Israel, former commander of British forces in Afghanistan and Iraq, who described it as groundbreaking and brilliant. And tonight we are very fortunate to have another highly influential and brilliant thinker herself, Melanie Phillips, the renowned columnist with the Times of London. I'll introduce her properly a little later in the evening. First, I'm going to introduce Gal, the book's author. Gal is a columnist for the Jerusalem Post. He's the author, as I said, of Judaism 3.0, Judaism's Transformation to Zionism, and he's also chair of the Judaism 3.0 think tank. He's an avid scholar of Theodor Herzl, and we did an event here a year and a half ago about applying Herzl's framework to today's issues. For about 2 decades, Gal lived in New York, where he was a Wall Street investment banker, advising financial instigation in US and Europe, and mergers and acquisitions, working in Citigroup and then JP Morgan. He's a native of Tel Aviv, has served in the Israeli army, and contrary to the popular trend, has done the opposite move to many people, has moved from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and he lives now in Jerusalem with his wife, Tamar, who's also here with us tonight. Gal, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Paul. Hello, everybody. I'm honored to be back here at the Begin Center for the launch of my new book, as Paul said, The Assault on Judaism. Thank you all for coming, which is completely not intuitive given the security situation. And thank you, everybody who's joining by Zoom and on the live broadcast around the world. I look forward, Melanie, to having an interesting conversation with you later in the evening. As Paul mentioned, I was here at this podium just over a year ago in September 2023. There was a different world back then, the world of yesterday, to use the phrase. Since then, we had October 7th. We are fighting a war for our survival. We've lost hundreds of soldiers and civilians. We have over 100 hostages in Gaza. We have communities in Israel displaced. We have families whose fathers and husbands has been in the military for months. We are really fighting a war, a physical war for our survival, and we will win. Now, as we see almost every day, Iran and its proxies have the capabilities to kill Jews, to kill many Jews. Sadly, we've noticed that today. But Iran does not have the capabilities to destroy Judaism. Those capabilities are housed in the West. And as Paul mentioned, when I was here a year ago, and I outlined a theoretical path to the destruction of Judaism that involved elements and actions of the West, sanctions, investigations by the ICC, sanctions by various Western countries, demoralization, attempt to instill Jewish insecurity, and economic siege of Jerusalem. That was all in theory a year ago when we were here in September 2023. Then October 7th happened, and this is no longer in theory. The destruction mechanism of Judaism has been activated, and we're now well advanced in a well-funded attempt to negate the idea of the Jewish state, and through that, to negate the idea of Judaism. And as I describe in the book, this assault on Judaism that's coming from the West is not just a threat to the Jewish state and to the survival of Judaism, it is also a strategic threat to US national security and to global stability. And still, this threat has not been, it's all but been ignored. People are not focusing on this threat. And this is one of the main reasons why I have this book, to try to refocus the world public opinion to this existential threat. Now, things I discuss about are discussed in context of anti-Semitism, discussed in context of media bias, discussed in political context, in an election context, but not in a strategic existential context. And I understand that. I understand why people do not want to talk about, an existential threat to Judaism that is coming from, polite Europeans wearing suits that we're kind of friends with in Europe. We can't talk about that when we have an active war, when we have Jews being killed, when we have missiles coming in. I completely understand why there is no focus on the assault on Judaism that's coming from the West. And people can say, you know what, let us fight the physical war. It's live, it's happening right now. And later, in a few years, when we survive the physical war, we can address the ideological assault that's coming from the West. Well, in a few years, it's going to be too late. As I describe in the book, the trajectory that was set on October 7th and what we've been seeing over the last year is advancing rapidly in multiple fronts. Month after month, we have new ideas and new initiatives that's coming from the West. And this threat is simply not something that can be ignored. In the book, I delve into the nuances and intricacies of this threat. I try to understand it, and I learned from Theodor Herzl, who at his time tried to understand anti-Semitism from the anti-Semite point of view. Some of his friends were anti-Semites. Anti-Semitism was a new thing at his time, and nobody at his time thought that it was a threat to the survival of Judaism. It was just, a political view. So I try in the book to explain and understand, using my background, how the media basically over the last year created a reality where the large portion of the global population is once again were incited against the Jews. I try to explain how governments, eventually friendly governments that are pro-Israel, that help us in the physical defense against the assault on Judaism, had to turn against us, had to partake in the ideological assault on Judaism, first in rhetoric and then in action. And I try to understand that the threat, the assault on Judaism from the West is coming not from bad people that are, they're also coming from friends, including my own friends. I try to have us all understand the complexities and the depth and the nuances of this assault on Judaism that's coming from the West, because only if we understand that, then we can develop tools to counter it and to focus on it. And as I mentioned, something that we've not done at all so far for understandable reasons. I also compared the threat to previous threats, to last century's threat, last century attempt to eradicate Judaism, and previous ones, and try to place it in the global geopolitical context. There's a motto in Israel that says, in every generation, somebody rises up to eradicate us. B'kol dor v'dor omdim alenu lechalotenu. And I think it's very clear to Israelis and people around the world that every generation is now. There is physical assault on Judaism, and there's an ideological assault on Judaism. But it is important to understand that the path to destroy Judaism, the ability to eradicate Judaism, is the ideological path. Now, I've talked about this ideological path for a decade, as Paul mentioned, about how Israel bashing and anti-Zionism is an existential threat to Judaism, but it was all theoretical. October 7th and what happened after that changed everything, because war crimes indictments need a war. You can't have a war crime indictment if there's no war. So this path to destroy Judaism was all theoretical. Now it's not, because we have a war, and we can have people telling us that we're committing war crimes, that we're once again dehumanizing Europeans or Palestinians or whoever it is that we're dehumanizing. Lecture us that it's not just how we do a right to defend ourselves, but it's how we defend ourselves. And this was the same in previous attempts. In the Middle Ages, some British wanted to kick the Jews out of England. They wanted to accuse the Jews for using the blood of Christian children to make Passover matzahs. But in order to have that, you need to have dead Christian children. So when there were a plague and diseases, then that could trigger a process to accuse Jews for using the blood of Christian children to make matzahs. And those accusations eventually, through a long process, led to the expulsion of Jews from England. England was Jew-free for centuries. Same with the Black Death. You could accuse Jews of deliberate starvation of European, but in order to accuse Jews of doing that, through polluting the wells, you need to have a Black Death. You need to have an epidemic. You have to have a pandemic. And that was the Black Death. So just like now, all this that was theoretical now became a reality. War crimes need a war. There's a war. And now we're far down the path, as I mentioned, of an attempt to eradicate Judaism through this ideological assault on Judaism. While we're here safe in Jerusalem, and we are safe here in Jerusalem, in Europe, the ground is being prepared for, once again, the mass arrest of Jews, of Israeli Jews. On May 19th, the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court filed requests for the arrests of the leader of the Jewish state, Benjamin Netanyahu, and its defense minister, Yoav Gallant. Something that is astonishing. But he also, in the same request for indictment, prepared the ground and the basis and the frameworks for the arrest of all Israeli soldiers that he accused are participating in a collective crime, which is once again the starvation of the Palestinian population. It's not the starvation of the European population, now it's the starvation of the Palestinian population. When I spoke here last year, somebody said, well, I mean, if this would happen, you know, Europe will sanction the ICC, the Netherlands will kick them out. The US will sanction the ICC. Well, they didn't. And the ICC continues over the summer until today to develop this infrastructure for the arrest of Israeli Jews. The ICJ, the International Criminal Justice, have joined them, and over the summer have prepared the groundwork for the arrest of settlers by taking some legal actions on that. And they both made it clear that it's not just soldiers and settlers, it's anybody that helps them. This is also over the last year became a concept, a principle. For example, in Canada, I discuss in the book the various assaults, the various fronts in the assault. In Canada, there was a effectively sanctioning of the Jewish National Fund, an Israeli environmental organization. Why? Because their work, in theory, can benefit Israeli soldiers. Israeli soldiers can breathe fresh air and enjoy picnic tables and green trees. So make no mistake, the ICC indictment or the preparation of ICC indictments are not just against Netanyahu and not against, you know, the head of the militaries or the head of it's against all Israeli Jews. And the Europeans says get out, the Europeans say no. France immediately, the next day, pledged its collaboration, which is astonishing. For the second time in 80 years, when arrest warrants are issued against Jews, France pledged to collaborate with them. Now, last time, 80 years ago in 1940s, in the previous attempt to eradicate Judaism, the French still today say, well, we have no choice. Germany invaded us. You know, we were under occupation. We couldn't do anything. The ICC did not invade France. France did that willingly. They pledged their collaboration and they weren't alone. Slovenia, Norway, other pledged the same. And nobody sanctioned the ICC, not even the United States. And as we said, as the summer progressed, those efforts have developed. President Macron of France, since then, further escalated last week. He connected the physical assault on Judaism with the ideological assault on Judaism. And as Israeli soldiers are fighting effectively for France, killing those terrorists that have murdered, the Hezbollah terrorists that murdered hundreds of French soldiers, he has a new initiative to embargo the Jewish state. War is a zero-sum game. He's effectively siding with Hamas and Hezbollah because the assault on Judaism is so strong and so popular and has such broad appeal in the masses after a year of incitement that we are seeing things like that. Now, Macron's action is not only has an effect that, you know, oh, we can get, you know, how are we going to fight Hezbollah if we're not going to have weapons? But it also solidifies the views of the Western public that there really is the problem here with the Jewish state. Because most people, you know, don't do a PhD on the Israeli Gaza, the Israeli Lebanon, the Israeli Iran, the Israeli Yemen, the Israeli Iraq front. They trust their opinion leaders in the media, in Amnesty, in the UN, and their leaders like Macron. So the fact that he has a position that the actions of the Jewish state are so malignant that they require an embargo in the middle of war instills the notion that, yes, there is a problem once again with the Jews, with the Jewish state. And it reawakens the Jewish question in Europe, a question that has been existing in various forms throughout the century. What do we do with those badly behaving Jews? And now the Jewish question manifests itself to the Jewish state. It's the Jewish state question. What do we do? What is the solution to the bad action of the Jews of the Jewish state? Now, we've spent time in the United States over the summer, and many American Jews said, well, I hear you, but what you're describing, you have to exact it. It's not an assault on Judaism, it's only assault on the Jews on that side of the ocean, right here. We American Jews are fine, which is cut and paste exactly the same thing that German Jews said in the 1930s, early 1930s. A lot of German Jews said, well, I mean, yeah, I get it. There's those Russian Jewish immigrants that are behaving in antisocial behavior that you see everywhere and are a problem. We agree. So this hatred towards them is not to us, proper German Jews of the Upper East Side of Berlin that served in the German army and served in World War I. It's against the Russian Jews. Same in every other assault on Judaism that I describe in the book. For example, in the Inquisition time, in the attempt in Spain in the 15th century to eradicate Judaism, there were those Jews who converted to Christianity and says, oh, this is not against us. We are now, new Christians, only to discover that it's their actual conversion that put them under the jurisdiction of the Inquisition and allowed the attackers to continue with the attempted liquidation of the Jewish nation after they've converted to what was called then New Christians. The attempt to draw that distinction doesn't work. And I think more and more people in America, American Jews, understand that the assault on Judaism, the attempt to instill Jewish insecurity, not just through the action of the ICCs, but also through actions that are happening in the United States, affects them, whether they're in Pennsylvania, or whether in Arizona, or wherever they are in the United States. The assault on Judaism is an assault on American Jews, on the left and on the right, including those who bash Israel themselves. So I spent the first 2/3 of the book describing the assault on Judaism that we just gave a little flavor on, and the last third about offering some creative solutions that maybe we can talk in the panel. One of which is what we discussed exactly in this auditorium a year ago, when I said that the assault on Judaism is carried through a sword and a shield, and the shield is Judaism 2.0, the illusion that Judaism is merely a religion. Once there's a recognition that Judaism is transformed and Zionism has become the anchor of Judaism, you cannot hide behind this facade that you love the Jews and you hate the Jewish state. And as a few people have told me, and as I've wrote in the updated version of the book, Judaism 3.0, October 7 turned Judaism 3.0 from a thesis into a reality of day-to-day life. And you can ask any Jewish person on college campus about that. I also talk about bifurcated strategies on different people who are committing the assault on Judaism. There are the hardcore Israel bashers, those that you see in pro-Palestine demonstrations, who are the most passionate people who are assaulting Judaism from the West, but they don't have the destruction mechanisms. There are, on the other hand, what I call the Israel bashers light, who are not organic anti-Semites or anti-Zionists or normative people and are my friends, but they're the one who have the destruction mechanism of Judaism, and they're the one who activated them. Each need to have a different strategy, and I discuss that in the book. I also discuss specific immediate strategies that the United States can take to counter the assault on Judaism, because as I mentioned, the assault on Judaism is a proxy for the assault on America, an attempt to negate America's Judeo-Christian foundation, but also very practically, the ICC tried to sanction American troops in 2020. President Trump sanctioned the ICC. When ICC tried to indict and go after American troops, American President Trump levied very heavy sanctions on the prosecutor and their families. The US can sanction the ICC because, Iran attacks Israel and the physical assault on Judaism in part because they attacked Israel as little Satan, as a proxy for attacking America as big Satan. The ICC now indicts Israeli soldiers and political leaders as little war criminal, as a proxy for later indicting big war criminals, and they're making it no secret. They can just cut and paste the indictments. The South African foreign minister, amongst the leader of the assault on Judaism through the ICC, said it openly. America is next. So America can indict the prosecutors and employees of the ICC and those who collaborate with them, but they haven't done so yet. And another thing that of the many things I discuss in the book, is that the assault on Judaism should not be viewed as an issue of anti-Semitism. It should be reclassified as a US national security issue. It should not be dealt by an anti-Semitic czar or committee or planting trees or writing textbooks. It should be dealt with on the National Security Council. And I will just end that with the notion that, I mentioned in the beginning that the motto that we say in Passover, that in every generation, somebody rises up to eradicate us, has a second part to this verse. And Israelis know with 100% certainty that we will prevail. We will prevail against the physical assault on Judaism, and we will prevail in the ideological assault on Judaism. The question is, what would the world nations do? Never before has there been such a clear demarcation. The world's nation and individuals can either bless Israel or they can curse Israel. Over the last year, we saw a lot of people who chose to curse Israel, including world leaders, including opinion leaders, people in the media, people from the mainstream. But we also saw a lot of people, individuals who defy conventional wisdom, who refuse to adhere to the propaganda they hear from various Western news media and from their own Western leaders, and have chosen to bless Israel. And I hope that this book, The Assault on Judaism, can expand this coalition of people who choose to bless Israel from the right and from the left, from various political, religious, and national backgrounds. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gal. Okay, I would now like to invite Melanie Phillips, British journalist, broadcaster, and author who's championed traditional values in the culture war for more than 3 decades. She writes a weekly column for the Times of London and the Jewish News Syndicate. She broadcasts on radio and TV, gives public presentations across the English-speaking world. Her first novel, Legacy, which deals with conflicted Jewish identity, anti-Semitism, and the power of history, was published in 2018, along with her personal and political memoir, Guardian Angel. Her previous books include her 2006 bestseller, Londonistan, about the British establishment's capitulation to Islamist aggression, and The World Turned Upside Down, the global battle over God, truth, and power, which was published in 2010. Melanie Phillips.
Thank you very much indeed, Paul. Good evening, everybody. Erev Tov. It's a great pleasure to be here, back at the Begin Center again. And it's a great pleasure to be invited to discuss Gal's book, which I've read with great enjoyment and interest. and a very valuable addition it is to the, unfortunately, burgeoning library of books that are being written about the crisis that the Jewish people are facing. The book is a very effective description of the forces that have come together to assault the Jewish people in Israel and in the world after the atrocities of October the 7th. And I think it's absolutely right to cast this, as Gol does, as an assault on Judaism. Apart from anything else, the assault on Israel, if one wants to sort of distinguish it from Judaism, Israel and Judaism, the assault on Israel contains or is characterized by the same characteristics that are unique to anti-Semitism throughout the ages, the use of double standards, the obsession with this particular cause, the blood libels, the imputation that the Jewish people in Israel are uniquely powerful and uniquely evil. These are all the tropes that we're all familiar with, and they have characterized what we've been living through in terms of the West's reaction to October 7 and the war that followed. I don't, however, think it's right to say that I certainly am not frightened that it's going to destroy Judaism. Judaism is eternal, and we are the eternal people, and we have seen off every enemy that has come for us. And it will also not destroy Israel. We are going to win this terrible war, even though we may be in for more terrible things before that happens, but we are certainly going to win it, and I don't think that the same story can be said about the West. So that's by way of kind of general introduction of my thoughts. The question that arises from this book and from thinking about the events of the last terrible year, why has the West collectively attacked Israel and the Jewish people in this way? Now, we don't need to be told. Anti-Semitism is always with us, and none of us, I'm sure, has ever thought that we would ever live in a world where it wasn't so. But nevertheless, we've never seen anything like this, the intensity, the global reach of what we've been living through. So there's a threefold source for this. Gol has briefly alluded to who's doing this, but I would break it down into three discrete sources. One is the far left, the ideological far left. Two are the Islamists, the people from the world of Islam who wish to colonize the world that's not Islamic or not Islamic enough and make it Islamic. And the third category, I would say, are the supporters of Palestinian rights in the West, who are not particularly ideological, but have basically bought into a particular narrative in which Israel is the bad guy always, and the Palestinians are their victims always. And I think in my remarks are going to really concentrate on this last group, the supporters of the Palestinian rights, not because the far left and the Islamists aren't important, they are absolutely critical, but because I think that the vast majority of people who support Palestinian rights are the people who empower the unholy alliance of the far left and the Islamists. They give them credibility, they give them credence, and they basically say, you may go a little bit far, but basically you're right. So why do they have this point of view of such hostility to Israel and the Jewish people? Well, we know that the narrative in the West for decades has been a narrative of lies, lies about the Palestinian cause, lies about the history of Israel, lies about the present situation of Israel, lies from start to finish about the position of Jews in the Middle East. And unfortunately, this Palestinian cause based on lies is the default position of the left. But I think that that's not really an adequate explanation for what we have been living through. I think something very much darker has been going on. We have to think, first of all, about the absolutely obsessive nature of this particular campaign. It's not just against Israel. It's not just saying Israel is doing terrible things. other countries do terrible things. They don't get this kind of attention. It's not just concern or compassion for the Palestinian people. There are plenty of other people who need compassion. And anyway, if you have compassion for the Palestinian people, which we should do, you would say they are the victims of the Hamas. They are the victims of the Palestinian Authority. So it's not compassion. And it's not even anti-Israelism. The tropes that are being expressed are the tropes of the ancient demonization of the Jewish people that we've all heard before, blood libels and so on, conspiracy theory and so on. And the really extraordinary and terrible thing is the omnipresence of this antipathy. It's among all kinds of people. I mean, the reach of it is astounding. I mean, I know most about Britain. And there are people who aren't necessarily political or ideological at all. They are doctors, they are lawyers, they are civil servants, officials, they're charity workers, they're vicars, they're priests, they're health workers, they're social workers. And everywhere you see the Palestine flag. The Palestine flag, so-called, is everywhere, has become a kind of meme of social justice. We see it on lapels. We see it on lampposts. We see it on buildings. We see it baked into cakes. I can't think of any cause where this has happened, where it's become a kind of global thing like this. So why is this obsession unique? And then to help think how strange this is, I would suggest we think a bit more about what we've all seen, and I'm sure recoiled in horror at, the images that were so conspicuous in the early months of the war, and they're still happening, of people tearing down the pictures, the posters of the hostages. Now, it takes a special kind of psychopathology to tear down a poster of a woman, a baby, an old person who has been captured and is being tortured and starved and raped and all the rest of it. And when you look at the video pictures of the people who were doing the tearing down, their faces were contorted with rage. Now, what is this? I mean, how on earth does one explain this? It is absolutely bizarre. So I would like to suggest make a few suggestions about this. I would say that the fury and the obsession and the rage are because for a certain type of person, they simply cannot stand, they really cannot stand any challenge to a particular narrative. And that narrative is that Israel is the bad guy and the Palestinian Arabs are the good guys, that Israel oppresses the Palestinian Arabs. And they cannot therefore acknowledge that Israelis or Jews have been the victims of those same Palestinian Arabs whom they have supported. And not just victims, but victims of those Palestinian Arabs who have carried out acts of unimaginable barbarity and savagery and depravity. Not just killing, not just kidnapping, but doing things to those Jews because they were Jews, and Israelis and even non-Israelis, but basically it's against the Jewish people, quite explicitly so, of extraordinary sadism. I don't need to tell you the details, but the fact is that if you are somebody of a particular ideological bent and you have supported the Palestinian Arabs all your life and you have basically not encountered or acknowledged anything to suggest that they are anything other than victims and are therefore kind of holy people. Because they're victims, they cannot do anything bad. Suddenly you find that they have done the worst possible things that a human being could do to another human being. You've had it dehumanized. They have been dehumanized and they have dehumanized others. What does that make you, the person of conscience who has supported those Palestinian Arabs? It makes you an accomplice to evil. It makes you having supported evil. Because for people who support the Palestinian cause, it's not simply a cause like They once supported apartheid. They once supported South African, black people in South Africa against apartheid, or they once supported, I don't know, Irish nationalism against, you know, they supported the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, against Britain. It's not that sort of cause. This is a cause by which they set their personal moral clock. They identify themselves as moral beings because they support this cause. And so they cannot admit any challenge to it because of the fear that if they were to say, oh yeah, they did actually do these terrible things, Hamas, yes, I agree, it was absolutely dreadful. They fear this would erase their entire moral personality. So no facts or evidence can be acknowledged as true that have come out against their narrative. But I think it's even worse than that. Because what did I see when I looked at the pictures of them tearing out, tearing down, literally with their fingernails, tearing? It's a violent act. And to me, they were tearing the Jewish people out of their sight, out of their heads, and out of their consciences. They wanted us gone. They didn't want to know about Jews anymore, because Jews were suddenly victims and they cannot stand the idea of Jews as victims. Because if Jews are victims, then it makes them complicit today in the cause they support, the Palestinian cause, and it makes them collectively complicit in the great crime of the Holocaust. Even though they weren't directly involved, the West was complicit, and they can't stand it. They can't deal with it. They have to get rid of us completely from our heads. And this terrible thing that happened on October the 7th, they cannot deal with it, and they will not deal with it, and they have to literally tear it down. So that's one theory. But I think there's a deeper cause still in ideologies that have taken over Western culture, and this kind of develops what you have written in your book, because you write about the kind of institutional onslaught from organizations like the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice, the United Nations, and all that gallery of rogues. But I would say there's behind all that, which is absolutely correct, the ideologies that have taken over Western culture, I think, offer us clues as to why this reaction in the West to both October 7 and the war that followed has been so perverse. It's a very complicated set of issues, and I will just glancingly refer to some of the kind of highlights of this culture. But basically, it's a culture which has got rid of the idea of objective truth and objective lies. It's basically a culture which has departed from the biblically based morality, which is the basis of Western civilization. And instead, it has formed a whole set of beliefs which center around the individual. What the individual does and says and how the individual lives must take precedence over any kind of moral codes. So, for example, it has given rise to what's called relativism, moral relativism. What I say is right for me is what is right. I feel that you have oppressed me. Doesn't matter what the facts are. The fact that I feel you've oppressed me means you have oppressed me. What I feel is what is true. And this is basically why the West has been led to basically hell in a handcart, because what is now balanced, because you can't choose, there's no such thing as objective truth. So you can't choose what is true. It's my opinion. I think it's, as Oprah Winfrey famously said, my truth. My truth is as valid as your truth. So you can't tell the difference between truth and lies. It's just a matter of opinion. I say this is true. You say it's a lie. That's your opinion. That's my opinion. Who wins? Well, whoever has the power wins. So truth and lies are in the balance. Truth and lies. We have to balance truth and lies. Who is the victim? Who is the victimizer? Doesn't matter. We must balance the victim and the victimizer. And this is what the BBC does. The BBC believes that it is the arbiter of balance and fairness. What does it mean by that? It means that you actually have to balance the person who is doing the murdering with the person who is being potentially murdered. And that's balance. I once said to a producer at the BBC, who was driving me completely crazy by consistently having in the studio a representative of the Hamas in order that I should argue with him. And I said to the producer, if this was like 1936, you would have said, oh, let's have her Goebbels in so you can have a discussion with him. And that's balance. And he said, yeah, I would have done that. And that's where we've got to. This is moral relativism. No such thing as truth. No moral distinctions, because there is no truth. And so it doesn't matter who starts the war. All that matters is the dead people. It doesn't matter that Israel is actually defending itself and that the Hamas or the Hezbollah are the aggressors. It doesn't matter. Let's just look at the number of bodies that pile up, because that's all that matters. And it doesn't matter what the numbers are, because these people are saying 41,000 of our civilians have been killed. That's good enough for us because we feel good about emoting, because my feelings trump all facts. And so this is also why we have this tit for tat. It drives me absolutely crazy. The BBC and no doubt other media outlets couch what's happening now as tit for tat. So Iran sent 108 missiles as a response to Israel killing Hassan Nasrallah. Excuse me? I mean, think back to the Second World War. That was tit for tat. Oh yeah, Britain bombed Dresden, and and it was like tit for tat for the Blitz. I mean, it's ridiculous. It's war. But this is not understood, and this is not acknowledged. The aggressor under this ideology is always the side with power, because what we're talking about is a set of views which basically are derived from Marxism. Marxism held that all relationships are based on power. Either you have power, in which case you are an oppressor, or you don't have power, in which case you are an oppressed person. The fact that the idea you can have power and actually be a good person, no, you can't do that. Oppressor and oppressed. And this is where we get to the whole business of victim culture and intersectionality, this idea that there are groups who are oppressed, and they're all basically together against the oppressor. And under this ideology, which is now standard in universities throughout the West, the Jew is the oppressor. The Jew is the oppressor. Why? Because Jews are powerful. Jews are powerful. Why? Well, because they're running everything. They're running the media. They're running the law. They're running capitalism. That is the view at the basis of intersectionality and victim culture. And there's something even worse than that, because not only do such people who go on about gender stuff and race stuff and heteronormative stuff and all that sort of stuff, not only do they cast the Jew as the oppressor, but they also come up with this amazing thing, which is that anti-Semitism has deprived me as an oppressed group of being a victim, because it sucked up all the victimhood in the world. And what do they mean by that? Well, when you press them, they say, well, the thing about anti-Semitism is that the Jews have got away with it. And it's meant that we can't be victims anymore, because anti-Semitism is such a big thing. There's no space for us. And when you look at anti-Semitism, actually, the Jews are using this to hide their misdeeds behind this claim that they are victims. And you say, well, what are they hiding? What do you think they're hiding? And the answer is, well, all the things that we believe about them. That they are uniquely powerful, that they further their own interests to the disadvantage of everybody else, that they're rapacious, that they're cruel, all those things. But we can't say that because of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is this enormous thing which prevents us from saying these things about the Jews. However, how successful was this, they say? Anti-Semitism has meant the Jews have got away with it. We can't say any of it. So we're going to have that. We're going to have that. We're going to say that because we're victims, we cannot be held responsible for anything. So at the very heart of this victim culture is the idea that the Jew is a really bad person. And it's another extraordinary thing that all the ideologies that form part of all this all have at their heart an attack on either Judaism, the Jewish people, or the state of Israel. Moral and cultural relativism, no such thing as truth. That is fundamentally an anti-Jewish notion. Multiculturalism, the idea that you cannot ever declare your allegiance to one culture because you have to basically say that all cultures are the same as all other cultures. Again, fundamentally anti-Jew. Materialism, the idea that there's nothing in the world, the universe, and beyond that can't be explained by things that actually exist. Fundamentally anti-Jew, anti-religion, and so on and so forth. And also fundamental to this is the attack on the idea of the nation state, on the basis that the nation state is the cause of nationalism, that nationalism is the source of prejudice and war. If you didn't have nationalism, you wouldn't have had Hitler. So get rid of the nation, you'll never have Hitler. Oh, here's Israel. Israel is not only a nation, it's an ethno-nation. It's a nation for a particular set of people, Jews. That is a really, really bad thing. We all believe in the brotherhood of man. And so the final thing that comes out of this is that because there is no such thing as a nation that we should support as a discrete thing, we all believe in the brotherhood of man, war is absolutely not on at all. You cannot go to war to defend your nation. This is itself a source of kind of madness. How many times have I heard in the last year, nothing was ever solved by war? Just think about that. Just think about that. What would Churchill have said to that? Nothing is ever solved by war. But I can tell you, I mean, I've never spoken to Mr. Biden and have no wish to. And I've never spoken to members of his administration, I've even less wish to. But I can tell you that they would say, no, 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 no. War is a really stupid idea. We have to have negotiation. We have to have compromise. And so that's why they hold Israel to this ridiculous standard that when Israel is being attacked existentially by Iran, by the Hezbollah, by the Hamas, with rockets and missiles and drones and all the rest of it, the response of the United States is to say, we must redouble our attempts to get a political solution to this. And they have absolutely no idea of what it means to be a fanatic. They have no conception of the fact that if you are a fanatic, you cannot negotiate with a fanatic because a fanatic's position is non-negotiable. And if you negotiate with a fanatic, you're effectively signaling that you are surrendering. And that's the kind of pressure that America is putting on Israel at the moment. It's the kind of pressure that Britain, if it had ever had any power these days, would wish to put on Israel. It's the sort of pressure that France, Monsieur Macron, is putting on Israel. It's the same fundamental liberal Western delusion that the entire world is full of people like us, people who are governed by reason and self-interest. And consequently, everything can be negotiated and everything is a compromise. Faced with a contest between God and the devil, they would split the difference. And so this is why we have the corruption of the international institutions, the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice, the United Nations. They're all based on this idea that we're all a brotherhood of man, that we do law, not war, that all conflict is open to negotiation and compromise, and so on and so forth. And finally, my absolutely final point is that, and I think this is certainly implied in your book, if not said explicitly, but there is a threat to the West from external enemies, Iran, Russia, China, North Korea. But in my view, the threat from these external enemies is made infinitely greater by the threat from within the West, caused by the fact that the West is no longer able or willing to defend itself because it will no longer even acknowledge what it's up against. So these are just a few thoughts that perhaps we can chew over.
Okay. People are already sticking their hands up. We're not getting to questions just yet, so calm down. We will get there, I promise. We're going to have a conversation, the three of us, and then we will turn to you to put your questions to us. But it's good to see the enthusiasm. Okay, so firstly, thank you both very much for extremely informative and thought-provoking remarks. Gal, I'm going to start with you. The book refers to the existential threat coming from the West. And you said a couple of times that this is not just about Israel and Judaism. You mentioned US national security. What I wanted to pick you up on, or just get a bit of a clarification about, is obviously the US is the leading power in the West, the leader of the free world, the leading force in the West. But the West is not just the United States. So are you distinguishing between the US and the rest of the West? Or is the US also part of this problem, as Melanie alluded to? And if so, how does that play into the threat to the United States that you talked about?
Well, first of all, I think it very much relates to what Melanie just said. The assault on Judaism is nuanced and layered, and there's no like specific, like people wearing black hats and white hats. And yes, there is the part of the assault on Judaism is carried from the United States. And I didn't talk about it in my remarks, but you have a reality that the public is so indoctrinated with the stuff of things that Melanie just described, that there is a problem with the Jews and with Judaism, with the Jewish state, that friendly governments like the United States had to act. So for example, on February 1st, President Biden issued an executive order, the first really executive, the first act in 80 years that targets specifically Jews. That executive order gives Treasury and state a very broad mandate to sanction Israeli Jews. Now, at first, it was dismissed as merely against forced settlers. And at the beginning, it was targeted, the foreign thugs, criminals that were targeted. But since then, this executive order has expanded to include community leaders, civic organizations, protesters, security groups, those who provide relief to the people that were sanctioned in the earlier rounds. And then there was an attempt to hijack the Leahy law that is meant to prevent American funds to going into like, crazy, criminal and organizations and dictators in all kinds of places that violate human rights. There was an attempt to hijack the Leahy law to sanction a unit of the Israeli military. Actually, the unit that allows Haredi Jews to serve. Netzach Yehuda. I mean, Netzach Yehuda is a poster child of the idea of inclusivity of DEI. So they were going after inclusivity and DEI, not intentionally. But they were trying to sanction them, not because there was not because something in Gaza, but because they found that in 2022, there was a criminal investigation, a criminal act that as a small group of individuals were involved with and were prosecuted for. They were going to defund a unit. This is the State Department. They were going to defund a unit of the Israeli military in the middle of war because of a criminal investigation that occurred in 2022. Well, in 2022, there was 3,700 criminal investigation opened in the Navy. So talk about the assault on Judaism as a proxy to the assault on Americanism. If you're a member of the Marines of the Navy and you see, wow, they're defunding a unit of the Israeli army, which is a poster child of inclusivity, which gives hopes to people that want to serve, that you don't need to be, you know, this or that. The army is open to everybody. They're going to defund it because of one criminal act. We had 3,700 criminal investigation open. Are they going to defund the Navy? Well, of course they're not going to defund the Navy. This is an assault on Judaism, but somebody else later on can say, oh, we have a precedent. We should defund the Navy, not this administration and not, you know. So what I talk about in the book is that the assault on Judaism is often done by well-intentioned people, by good people, but it has consequences, and one of the consequences is deliberate or indeliberately assault on American soldiers, on American troops, on American principles. And we've seen that through those actions over the last year.
Okay, thanks, thank you. Melanie, I was very struck by your focus on this the third group, not the far left, not the Islamists, but this third group. Maybe it's because I also grew up in the UK, so I also know a lot of these people. Went to university with them and everything. One of the things that came to mind actually when you were talking about how the Palestinian cause is so central to their worldview and their own morality. And I thought about the way in which obviously you had some at the sort of extreme end of that who responded to October 7th by saying either it didn't happen or it was exaggerated, or that, you know, celebrated it. But then you had others who used this sort of kind of weasel word language where they would say that was Hamas. That's not the Palestinians, of course. That's not the ordinary Palestinians that I support. And you saw that, I think, in the rush, the sort of completely illogical and counterintuitive rush to support a Palestinian state in the wake of October 7th, which seemed sort of crazy in all kinds of ways. I wanted to ask then, do you think that the uniqueness of the Palestinian cause over and above every other cause, every other people that is supposedly suffering or oppressed, is that because the Jews are the alleged perpetrators? Is that what it's about? That it's because it's the Jews? Because you also don't see anyone rushing to defend Palestinians when they were being slaughtered by the Assad regime, for example, people that love Palestinians. Is it about the Jews?
I'm afraid so, yes. I mean, I thought about this a lot over the years, because of course what we're talking about predates this madness, which is particularly dreadful in the last year, but it predates it very considerably. I have felt from the first time I really started noticing this, which was in 1982 in Britain, the glee. It's glee. I can't exaggerate the glee with which people leap on the idea of the Israeli Jew as an oppressor. They may look at, as they did, apartheid South Africa with horror, quite rightly. They may look at, as I said before, you know, Northern Ireland Catholics with sympathy and anger that, you know, this is a righteous cause. But the glee with which they found Ariel Sharon in 1982 was a Nazi. At last, the Jew is a Nazi. Now we're free. Now we are free. We're free of the guilt. We're free of these dreadful people being our conscience the whole time. They tell us they're so much better than us. They lay down the moral rules that constrain me and my ability to represent myself to myself. That's all now, thank goodness. And I was told this in terms by a liberal journalist, a liberal editor, who I'd previously held in high esteem as being an open-minded, nice guy. And he said, what you have to understand is that it's such a relief that we don't have to worry about the Jews anymore. This was 1982, or thereabouts, when Israel was in Lebanon, and we had the Israeli as Nazi. That's the first time I heard it.
And all that, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's such a relief we don't have to worry about the Jews anymore. And to put it mildly, this is an ambiguous thing to have said. And I said, well, what do you mean you don't have to worry about Jews anymore? In what way were you worried? And then he said, well, and it was so unexpected. I was so shocked. I could hardly believe what I heard. He said, well, you have to understand that since the Holocaust, we weren't able to say what we thought about the Jews. And I said, what are you telling me? What are you telling me? That now you've got the Jew as Nazi, you're free from Holocaust guilt? And you can now be anti-Semitic again because you're freed from the constraint that meant you couldn't say terrible things about the Jewish people? And he said, that's not what I said. And I said, that's exactly what you just said. Now, the point was, he didn't think that's what he said. He didn't think that. Because, you know, these people, they don't sit there thinking, you know, I hate Jews and therefore I'm a really bad person. No, they think I'm a really righteous person and I really think the Jews are awful. And you have to get your head around this, and it's very, very hard to do so.
Yeah.
But so ever since, and also in this year, and you can hear it not just in this year. I remember, you know, the wretched BBC. I'm sorry to come back to the BBC, but it is rather an obsession. And I remember, you know, in wars gone by, whichever one it was, you know, whatever year it was, I mean, one of these Gaza campaigns, and it was preceded by, I don't know, rockets or whatever it was. And it was going on for weeks. And, you know, eventually the Israelis cranked themselves up and eventually they went in. And I remember the excitement in the voice of the BBC presenter, the radio presenter. Now it's kicking off. Now it's kicking off. The moment the Israelis went in, that's when it started. The fact that Israel had been under assault for N weeks or months was nothing. It started with Israel. Israel is the aggressor. Israel is the initiator. And it's the excitement and the glee. Now they're for it. Now we're going to see, again, the Israelis are going to reveal themselves to be vicious and child killers. And we all know it's coming, and out it comes, but it's the glee with which they do it, with the glee with which they say it, the enthusiasm, the excitement. This is a characteristic. I can't think of a single cause ever which has produced this kind of reaction. Right. And so it tells me that the impulse is because it is the Jews that are involved.
Yeah. Yeah. As given the building we're in and my role here at the Begin Center, I'd be remiss not to mention that when, after the Sabra and Shatila massacre in Lebanon, which was essentially Palestinian civilians being slaughtered by Lebanese Christians, Menachem Begin said, the Goyim kill Goyim and they blame the Jews, which I thought was quite maybe appropriate for this conversation as well. Gal, so I want to, because this is not one of these conversations where there's dissent and debate and people telling you you're wrong. So I'm going to play a little bit of that role, not to say you're wrong, but just I think it's part of my job is to be a little bit provocative. So I'm going to challenge you on something. Basically, it's this: in your presentation, I think there will be some people who will listen to it and say, up to this point, I agree, but he's going too far. It's too apocalyptic. It's too extreme. There's not going to be I don't know. No one here agrees with what France did and what Macron did, but it's not the same as Vichy France. How would you respond to that kind of critique?
First of all, I didn't go far enough. I stopped early. You'll have to read the book for how far did I go. But all you got to do is watch the video from our discussion a year ago. And we had a panel and we had questions from the audience, and people said exactly what you just said. That my view a year ago, that we can have a path to the, where I call it a path to destroy Judaism, but fine, you can call it something else. That all of a sudden the International Criminal Court will start issuing arrest warrants that will have sanctions by our ally, who we all need to be, I think every Israeli has to be extraordinarily grateful to the United States and to the Biden administration, to President Biden, for standing with us over the last year in the physical assault on Judaism. But we also have the same administration who partakes in the ideological assault on Jews. And people said, no, you're too apocalyptic. They're never going to do sanctions. Try to defund an Israeli military unit in the middle of battle, try to have partial embargo. So we had that. But I'm going to go a step further. And I discuss in the book, and I maybe did not reiterate it, that we are farther along today in the attempt to eradicate Judaism than we were a century ago in the 1920s in that century's attempt to eradicate Judaism. And I say that because, one of those assaults had an ideological component, had a physical component, had all those layers. But the public opinion today is much more set against the Jews, the Jewish state that is, than it was in the 1920s. I mean, the Germans elected a government where they had Jewish foreign ministers. I mean, the Germans were great in the 1920s. You tell a German in the 1920s, oh, one day, Nazi, what? Europeans used to hate us because of religious reasons. Now Europeans are secular. Enough with this paranoia, apocalyptic, one day you'll kill the Jews. And, I'm saying this, and I don't want to put anybody on the spot here, but I'm honored that we have here Rina Quint, who is not just a Holocaust survivor, but somebody that speaks about the Holocaust, who spoke to President Biden about the Holocaust, who President Biden, came and spoke with her and then stayed with her much longer than the time that was allotted. So I say it with a it's not something that's that you can say with easily, that we are so far along in the attempt to eradicate Judaism in this century than we were in the last century. But, we are, when it comes to the global public opinions, when it comes to, Melanie, as you discussed, the institutions that have the buy-in, then it was the anti-Semitic ideology. Now it's the anti-Zionism and Israel bashing ideology. We're much farther along. There's a much greater buy-in. And as I mentioned, the attempt to eradicate Judaism is not through a physical attempt of killing Jew by Jew as it was in the last century. It's through an ideological attempt, through the idea to try to negate the notion of a Jewish state, and through that, to negate the idea of Judaism. And as Melanie described, with all those factors that go into that, we're much farther along in that process. So for those who say this is too apocalyptic, they say that in every, I mean, I go over the various previous iterations of attempt to eradicate Judaism in the book. Pick your session. I mean, in Spain in 1490, if you said, oh, one day, they'll deport the Jews, they'll have this thing. It's happening. It's live.
Okay, I think that's called doubling down. Okay, I believe that's called doubling down. Very good. No, yeah. Fair enough.
Double down more.
Okay. We'll save it for now. Melanie, I wanted to ask you, you're famously forthright in calling these things out wherever you see them, speaking truth to power, including, as I think you've implied today, also people that you might at some point you thought highly of, or friends of yours, but who disappointed you in this way. How do you think we should deal with not those people that are clearly out and out anti-Semites, the enemies of the Jewish people, the enemies of Israel, but people who, in some ways, are actually maybe friends of ours or helpful for us or supportive of us, but also do things which are problematic for us? I mean, so for example, you and Gal both criticized the current American administration. It's also true that they've supported us in lots of ways. That I think just today they announced they're going to give us this new missile defense system. They were instrumental in helping us both in April and recently against the Iranian missile threat. I think Biden certainly believes himself to be. I think he is genuine when he says that he's a friend of Israel, that he supports Israel, that he's a Zionist. But clearly, there's other things that many of us would be very critical of that he's done and that you have been critical of. So, do you think that that we should just say, okay, listen, he might have done all these great things, but ultimately, he and other governments, which have been much less supportive, are basically not supportive, are enemies, are people that we should be opposing? Or where do you strike that balance between opposition to these governments or public figures, leaders, and finding some kind of nuance where you'll support some things, disagree with them on other things?
I think what you're saying can be boiled down into two bits.
Okay.
And they're sort of separate but related. One is to do with political frenemies,
okay,
like America, and the other is what we do with our own friends who have views which are obnoxious to us.
Yeah.
And I think the two are not quite the same.
Okay.
How does one regard America? Well, it's very perplexing because they are speaking out of two sides of their mouth simultaneously and have been, I think, since October 7. Basically saying, we support Israel's right to self-defense, of course, and we have Israel's back, and we have an ironclad commitment to Israel's security, and Israel must not do anything that we don't like hitting Iran. Okay. And everything they've done has been, this two-faced idea that, on the one hand, they sent the destroyers into the waters near Israel. Thank you very much. They've supplied weapons. Thank you very much. They are now supplying this new thingy. Thank you very much. But they've also held back weapons as a weapon against Netanyahu to make Netanyahu do what? Palestine state. Excuse me.
Right.
This is out to lunch. Okay. So how does one parse this with difficulty? But my general view is that this administration, and that is to say, Democrat administrations, I would say Obama, Biden, Biden, Harris, they have a particular worldview. And that worldview involves a plan for a new Middle East order, which Israel is not going to be allowed to disrupt. And in that new Middle East order, Iran will play a very important part. As I understand it, it sounds completely bizarre to me, but as I understand it from back in the Obama days, it was called the Obama Doctrine. It's to do with a balance of power in the region between Sunni Saudi Arabia, which was too powerful. It needs a balance, so that would be Shia Iran, and nuclear Israel is too powerful, so that needs a balance with nuclear Iran. Oh, by the way, we're trying to stop Iran from getting the bomb, of course, except for the sunset clause, which meant that in the 2015 agreement deal, Iran would have got a legitimate bomb with a few years delay, right? So what does all this amount to? It amounts to a very confused picture, but I think that my understanding and my impression of this confusion of the last year is that America's current administration will not allow Israel to be destroyed on its watch. They do not want Israel destroyed, and they do not want to be held responsible for Israel being destroyed. But they want Israel to continue to swing in the wind. They don't want Israel to win, because winning is inconvenient to their worldview, which must prevail. So we have this absolutely bizarre set of policies which don't make any sense unless you understand it in that way. That's them. What do we do about our former friends?
Former friends,
or our current friends? Now, I mean, look, I go to London a great deal, and I speak to a lot of people, both Jewish and non-Jewish. And the Jews of the left are in a terrible state.
Yeah.
They're in a much, much worse state than people here in many respects, and I'm not for a moment diminishing the agony of people here. It is acute. They're not in that way at all. They don't even understand what it is to be going through what the Israelis have gone through for the last year. But they're in a different kind of place, which is very, very difficult for them because they're lost. They're lost. They don't know how to deal with what they can't bring themselves to see. They can't bring themselves to acknowledge it. So they are wringing their hands and saying, you know, why is this happening? And if only Netanyahu wasn't there, and if only a Palestinian state was there. They're hanging on desperately to these absolutely threadbare fig leaves, which are of no use whatsoever, never were any use. So can you explain to them, can one explain to them, can one actually lead them out of, you know, the error that has caused them to sign up to the wrong stuff and leave them stranded? I'm afraid, well, some of them, yes. Some of them already have.
Yeah.
They have. They have said, I now see it. I now see it. But I would suggest that they are a minority. I would suggest that the majority, I'm not, perhaps that's not true, perhaps it is the majority, but anyway, some have got it, and some will never get it for the reasons that I tried to lay out, that they fear that if they were to say, you know what, you're right, then horror of horrors, they might turn into me. They might become right-wing. They might become very right-wing. And then they would lose their friends.
Right.
And they wouldn't be invited to shishi dinner parties anymore. And they would think of themselves as really bad people. And they might even have to support Mr. Trump.
Mm. Very, very good answer. Okay. All right. I think we will turn to questions. I'm going to ask one of my colleagues to come down and grab. I'm going to have to take one of these mics because we're going to use it for mic for the audience. Just okay. So keep your hands up. We're just going to wait for a mic. Second. Okay. Yeah, Hila, front row here. First question.
Thank you very much. I haven't heard the word jihad yet. And in listening to both of you, I'm wondering what your reaction is to Israel in South Lebanon taking the captured Hezbollah weapons, bringing them next to the UNIFIL bases and saying, you had 15 years to get rid of these. And look what we've done in 2 weeks to basically call out the hypocrisy and ridicule what you called the anti-Israel light variety of things and do it very dramatically. So what are your thoughts on jihad and something dramatic to do?
So, thank you for the question. I think that I'll take a step back and, Theodor Herzl, to answer your questions, Paul, he was also accused of being apocalyptic and doubling down. And one of the things that was told to him is that, don't worry, if your crazy ideas that one day Europeans will turn against the Jews will happen, the monarchs and the kings and the governments will save them. And it was true at that time. The governments were friendly to the Jews, and they would. Herzl said no. Even the most friendliest governments would not be able to resist the populist pressure. He studied the populists. He was one of the pioneers in understanding those populist sentiments, and he understood that you can be the most pro-Jewish king, not even somebody who needs to get elected, and he wouldn't be able to resist this movement. So what's happening in the United States now is that we have an election, and people need to get elected, with a particular doctrine. Now, it's not just an issue of voters. It's a little bit simplistic to say, oh, we're going to be anti-Israel so we can get, or we're going to be harsh on Israel. We're going to find the right, verbiage about Israel so we can get voters in Michigan or young progressives. There's also, sadly, in the United States, a lot of the power rests not with the voters, but with the donors. And many of those donors have those 1990s doctrines that Melanie, you alluded to. Certainly the sacrosanct idea of the two-state solution that's been utterly rejected by Israelis on the left, by Israelis on the right, by Palestinians, by Henry Kissinger, and has somehow made it into the executive order as sort of an indirect way to justify sanctions against Israeli Jews. And I tell my friends in America that the world does not begin in West Hampton and end in East Hampton. And somebody answered to me, in an election year, it does. So in an election year, those two-state solution and all those templates get elevated. And therefore, it manifests itself in the behavior patterns that you've just described. Oh, UNIFIL, oh, no, you shot at the UN? Bad, can't do that. Don't do this, don't do that. So we have to maybe try to draw a little bit of this nuanced distinction between, organic beliefs of leaders and their need to get elected. And whether we like it or not, in a democracy, they need to get elected and they need to get money from their donors. And the donor base, certainly of the Democratic Party, is very much stuck in those frameworks that Melanie described.
Okay, did you want to answer or should we just move on? Let's go to a different question. Okay, let's have this lady here. Yes, Hila.
Thank you to all the panelists and congratulations to you, Gol, on this another fabulous book. My question is, we've discussed the left, we've discussed the right, the Shishi dinner parties. Just to say as well, for context, I've just come off a flight from London, so much of the sentiment is very fresh. But yes, we've discussed all of these key players. What about Hashem?
The question was, what about Hashem? God. For those that need the translation. Okay, so is there a question? So does someone want to address that? The question of God and all that, the question of, or broadening out the question of religion more broadly, of Judaism as a religion?
Well, I'm not quite sure what you have in mind, but I would say that the sort of things I was talking about, which was the way in which the West has turned so self-destructively and destructively against the core tenets of civilization, are to do with a denial of biblical values and a secular world which basically has sought to replace God by man. So that, I think, is a very significant part of the reaction that we are seeing. If you're suggesting that what we've seen in the last year is the manifestation of a divine plan, I'm afraid that's somewhat above my pay grade. And I couldn't possibly give you a coherent answer on that. But I would say that a lot of people do see the working of divine destiny in what's unfolding, both in in particular in the last few weeks. I think it's very striking that a lot of people, I was talking to somebody in London who said, look, what we've seen is miraculous. It cannot be explained by any other way. And he's a secular guy. And he also said, he's a secular guy. He's not a religious guy at all. He's a secular guy. However, he said, I will confess to you, he said, having said this to me, that, I think it's basically a miracle. This was the exploding pages and all of that, and the killing of Nasrallah, and all the killing of the entire command structure of the Radwan unit. Having said that to me, as a secular guy, he said, I have to confess that I made a bargain with the Almighty on October the 8th. I said, if Israel survives, I'll believe. And I said to him, you've got to keep your word.
You know, I said earlier in my remarks that the world has a clear choice either to bless Israel and to curse Israel. And my evangelical Christian friends in the States remind me that God blesses those who blesses Israel and curse those who curse. So I leave it up to people's faith. But a lot of people ask, you know, relating to your questions earlier, is this a religious war? You asked about jihad. And I think there is an element of a religious war here, but not in the obvious way. There is a war, a global war, ideological war, Cold War, between the legacy monotheistic faith that the United States is anchored in and Israel is anchored in, and some of our friends are anchored in, and this relatively new form of atheisms, that even anti-theism, that came out of the French Revolution and much of Europe is based on. So in another capacity, in my website, Europe and Jerusalem, I talk about the Europeanism versus Americanism chasm as our century global divide. Europeanism based on universalism, on post-nationalism, and on atheism that has turned to anti-theism, and Americanism that is based on particularity, on nationalism, and on faith in God. One nation under God. So we've seen elements of that, I think, in this war. There is a religious element, but it's not necessarily, it's maybe you can extrapolate it into the competing frameworks that are offered by, in the United States itself, by the Abraham Accord, which is basically accepting people who they are, accepting the Arab world as they are, and making peace with Israel, you know, peace for peace. And those white colonialist frameworks like the two-state solution that has nothing to do with Palestinians, with Arabs, with Israelis, with Jews, but has to do with what's happening between West Hampton and East Hampton. And somebody can do a study, I can just do it anecdotally, if there's a correlation between those who support a two-state solution and atheism.
Okay. A lot of questions. We don't have too much time. Okay. Let's go to this gentleman, and then I promise I'll go to some people further back. Okay.
Thank you very much. I would like to, first of all, we're in a war on many fronts, not just up north and south and all that. We are in a war on social media. There is a scandalous bias with LinkedIn and with Facebook that pushes the proper narrative and blocks all the people that support Israel. Not all of them, we're too many, but I can bring lots of examples. And it's just, you know, we all know the people that say, oh, I have nothing against the Jews, it's the Zionists that I can stand. Mm. And that's, what more can I say about that? Is anybody reacting to this? I see that we should have some action legal against the platforms that block our narrative.
Okay, so for those that didn't catch that, this is a question, an excellent question about the role of social media and online platforms in spreading anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism.
I would just say very briefly that what I mentioned earlier, that we're much farther advanced today in the attempt to eradicate Judaism to an attempt to negate the idea of a Jewish state than we were in the 20th century is because of exactly what you just mentioned. The dissemination. In the last century, you had opinion leaders like Wagner and others that says, well, the Jews are committing crimes against humanity, or to use their term, polluting humanity. Today, it's not just opinion leaders, as you mentioned, it's people that take it on social media, and the speed in which the global mind is indoctrinated against the Jews, it's much quicker, and therefore today, quickly, a year after October 7th, we have so much of the global population that believes that there's a bad actor here and there is a Jewish state.
Okay, so I'm going to go further back. Yes, the gentleman in the cap, yes. He's just taking it off. Very polite of you. Can you use the mic, because I want the Zoom audience to hear as well?
You mentioned, Melanie, you mentioned the three forces. I was expecting the usual green, red, brown alliance, brown being the wacky extreme right. You didn't mention them. You instead focused on the people whom you did not, you didn't put in the bin of the left camp. Why did you, to me, the so-called values they aspire to or they proclaim, they seem to be the same as the general extreme left, let's say, that you have already described.
Okay, so you're just to, I want to make sure we understand this properly. You're saying that the third group that Melanie focused on in her talk, to you they are part of what the first group, the far left. So why did you see them as a distinct? Why did you see that third group as a distinct group rather than as part of the far left?
Thank you.
Okay, I'm still a bit confused because I thought you mentioned the far right as well.
So he was expecting you to mention the far right, but you didn't.
I see. Oh, I see. Right. Yes. Okay. Well, because I think there is a distinction. While I think it's perfectly true that there's been a kind of shift of political gravity, so that what was once long ago called far left is now left. In other words, the left has become the far left. And what was once long ago called the center is now called the right. So there's been that kind of shift. But nevertheless, put that to one side. Having said that, I think that there is such a thing as the hard left still. They are overt revolutionaries. They want to destroy Western civilization. They are marching shoulder to shoulder with people who despise every part of what they want to achieve. In other words, the Islamists. The Islamists also want to destroy Western civilization. So the far left and the far right, the far left and the Islamists are marching shoulder to shoulder in the same goal, even though the societies they want to replace the West with are very different from each other. And those people are extremely important. However, as I said in my remarks, I think the most important people are the people who you think are the same people as the far left, who are the kind of people who are not particularly political. They certainly don't believe in overturning Western civilization, but they've subscribed in large measure to ideologies which do overturn Western civilization. They don't even know that. They think that they are supporting, I don't know, they're supporting racial tolerance by taking the knee to Black Lives Matter. They're supporting harmony between cultures. That's what they think. In my view, they're actually taking the knee and making an obeisance to a revolutionary, anti-Western, anti-white, anti-Jewish, anti-police creed. They don't think that. In their minds, they are basically brotherhood of man types. They believe in an ideal. They believe that they are marching in these terrible demonstrations, which to me are hate marches, every single one of them. They are marching alongside the far left and the Islamists, who are screaming, the Islamists certainly are screaming for the murder of Jews, globalize the Intifada, from the river to the sea, destroy Israel. They're marching alongside those people, but they have in their minds something quite different. They have in their minds that they're marching not for the extermination of Israel, they're marching for the rights of Palestinians to live free of oppression. That's in their minds. So those people are the people that I've known forever who have subscribed to this ideology which tells them that Israel is the colonizing, oppressive force in the Middle East, and the Palestinian Arabs are their victims. They're not the far left. They are ordinary, fairly unideological, fairly apolitical people who consider themselves to be liberal, who may have voted Lib Dem at the election, not even for the Labour Party. And even if they vote for the Labour Party, they're kind of soft left. I mean, there is a difference. I agree that it's blurred. And I agree that what they are signing up to is hard left, in my view. But in their minds, it's not. It's part of a general worldview, which is pretty daft and pretty silly and pretty naive and pretty kumbaya, but that's different from being far left. It makes them useful idiots.
Right. Yeah.
And they are the most important people and the most important threat to us.
Okay, thank you. Okay, let's take two. We'll take two more, I think. Let's go for this gentleman here. And then Hila, I'm going to ask you to go around.
Where is the playbook for Jewish activism in the West? What do we do? I mean, I think everybody here agrees with what the panel is saying. So what do we do about it? Second question is, what's your opinion of the efforts by North American Jewish mainstream organizations in mobilizing Jewish support?
Jewish support for?
Support for Israel in America.
Okay.
What about Jewish support in Israel?
The first question was about Jewish activism. The second, what do you think about North American efforts by North American Jewish organizations to mobilize Jewish support for Israel?
So on the first question, I mean, first of all, American Jews got to get rid of this ludicrousy of zero tolerance to anti-Semitism, which was last century's threat, and a green light to Israel bashing and anti-Zionism, which is this century threat. And as I mentioned a year ago in this event, you have Jewish Americans, Jewish journalists that are putting their own lives in risk, their children's at risk through the click of their keyboard and the stroke of their pens because they're bashing Israel. And even last year, even before October 7th, the vast majority of attacks against American Jews were driven by Israel bashing and anti-Zionism and not by traditional anti-Semitism. So first of all, have this switch. And as I mentioned in the book, have this recognition that Judaism is transformed. This is not about gefilte fish and about Fiddler on the Roof and about, you know, I said that Gal Gadot replaced Barbara Streisand and Wonder Woman replaced Yentl. Zionism has become the anchor of Judaism. And you have to understand that because the world understands that. The only people that don't understand that is a subset of American Jews. And it's quite fascinating that, you know, as I mentioned earlier, some of them says, oh, no, we're completely immune for this, attack on the Jewish state because we're Jews that believe in values of tikkun olam and other things. Well, Israel is a tikkun olam state. We address hunger and famine by turning air into water and do all those wonderful things. But we also are the tikkun olam state because we eliminated more terrorists on the US most wanted list and made the world safer. So what can American Jews do is recognize a reality and not live in the world of yesterday, of the 20th century, when Judaism was something else.
Well, I can't speak really to North America very much, but I suspect it's not so very different from British Jews. Where the default position is to play it safe and keep your head below the parapet. And although American Jews are very different from British Jews in that they're not as timid for various reasons, I think the effects have been the same. When you look at what the Jewish community in the diaspora has said about the position of Israel vis-a-vis the onslaught upon it over many decades, it has collectively said virtually nothing that is actually germane to the problem. It is occasionally, I'm talking now about the British Jewish leadership, it occasionally speaks up in the most egregious, over the most egregious offenses by the media or British government, whatever. But generally it keeps its head down in public. And it prefers to work behind the scenes in trying to lobby for its cause. And as a result, it doesn't speak up for what it needs it doesn't say what it needs to say, and it leaves the British public completely in the dark. For example, it doesn't ever speak up against Muslim anti-Semitism. Instead, it speaks up against Islamophobia. This is the British Jewish community leadership. If you speak against Muslim anti-Semitism, as I do, in the Jewish community leadership's eyes in Britain, I am an Islamophobe and I am shunned by the British Jewish community leadership. Now put me to one side. This is insanity. This is absolute insanity. And it means that the Jewish community is just not defended against a very significant part of a very significant community, which is attacking it. Secondly, it never speaks up about, for example, the legality of Israel's actions. It is silent when the British government and others defame Israel forget the war for a minute, forget what's been happening, but defame Israel over international law. They say it's an illegal occupation of the Palestinian territories. Every one of those words, apart from the definite article, is wrong. And yet the Jewish community leadership has never, to my knowledge, stood up and said, the British government is lying. And it is inciting hatred and prejudice by these lies, and it's got to stop. It's never stood up and said, the British government, historically, is the reason for this whole mess in the Middle East in the first place, because the British government reneged on its obligations in the 1930s by coming up with the first two-state solution, which was a surrender to genocidal onslaught. And it has continued that policy to this day. And that is the reason we have this slaughter in the Middle East. British government. The Jewish community leadership has never, ever said any of that. And as a result, the British community, the non-Jewish community, hasn't got a clue what's going on here and what the stakes are and what the issues are. Israel doesn't say it, and that's also a terrible problem. Put Israel to one side. We're talking about what the Jewish community leadership should be doing. That's what it should be doing, standing up and saying all this. Now, why doesn't it say it? Well, various reasons. First of all, timidity. It's frightened, and it should be frightened, but it is frightened, and it doesn't have the courage to overcome that fear and stand up and do what it must be doing. Secondly, and I think this is much more important, there is this, and I'm sure this is true of the American Jewish community as well, or the majority of it, there is this tremendous desire to fit in and to go along with the consensus of the day. And this is particularly true of the American Jewish community, the majority of whom have subscribed to ideologies which I was alluding to earlier, which are actually anti-Jew. And the most terrible thing of all about the American Jewish community is that it has said to itself, this is tikkun olam. These anti-Jewish creeds are tikkun olam. They've persuaded themselves that they are Jewish creeds. And I was watching this great guy, Amir Hirsch. You know Amir Hirsch? Yeah. He's a Reform rabbi. And I'm watching him on Twitter at the moment, X, I'm sorry, berating himself and the Reform community. He is saying, what did we do that was so terrible? What did we do that has produced so many members of the Reform community in America who have turned against Israel? I can tell him, but I'm sure he wouldn't wish to hear that. But anyway, he is a brave guy. He is actually now beginning to grapple with the essence of it, that the American Jewish community has turned against the precepts of Judaism. And this comes back to my final point, which is that if one wants, if the Jewish community leadership, if the Jewish community leadership in the diaspora is to stand up and say these things, which I think they should be saying, then it has to stop thinking of Judaism as an add-on. You know, I'm a British person, but I'm also a Jew. Mm. I'm an American, and I'm also a Jew. I'm a proud Jew, but I'm a British person, and I'm an American person first. And why is this? Well, I can again only really speak to Britain. The British Jew is terrified of being considered to be part of a nation of Jews. Mm. They think that if they identify as a Jewish nation, then, especially with the actual nation of Israel, the state of Israel, but if they identify as a Jewish nation, they will be accused of dual loyalty. They're correct. They will be. I have been, and I was before I even came here. So it's going to happen anyway. But the fact is, that's what they're frightened of. And so they don't identify themselves with the Jewish nation. And that's what they have to do. That's what the American Jews and the British Jews and the French Jews and all the diaspora Jews have to do. They have to now realize that October 7 changed everything. We are one Jewish nation. We must bind together as one Jewish nation, even though we don't actually physically live here, perhaps. And we must identify as a Jewish nation and stand up for the Jewish nation as a nation, and not be apologetic, and not cringe, and not kowtow, and not be frightened, and not put our heads below the parapet. We must stand up as proud Jews, as a Jewish people, a nation fighting for its life, and we must say the truth about what that involves in a way that we have never done before.
Okay, there's a lot of hands up. I'm afraid we have time for one more question and that's it. So I apologize. I'm going to go for the gentleman there with his with the glasses. Oh, they both have glasses? My what? Okay, okay. So I meant the gentleman without the beard. Sorry, nothing against beards. Nothing against beards. Okay.
Thank you so much. Achron Chaviv, glad to have the last question. I know we all acknowledge there's been a shift towards secularism, but I wonder if there isn't a vestigial Christian anti-Semitism lurking behind that. The old saw about the Christians saying, "I'm really not sure if Jesus ever lived, but I'm certain about who killed him." Perhaps that applies, that even though there's been a shift towards secularism, but this vestigial Christian-based anti-Semitism still might lurk within their hearts. Could that be behind a lot of this?
Any volunteers?
Well, that's certainly true in Britain. And I'm not sure it's quite the same in America, but I'm sure it's not quite the same in America. It's different in America because Christianity, the churches are quite different, Britain and America. But I can certainly tell you about the Anglican Church, which has revived the ancient calumny going back to the early church fathers of what's sometimes called supersessionism and sometimes called replacement theology. This was the heresy. It was considered a heresy for many centuries. The heresy by which the Jews, because they denied the divinity of Jesus, were held to have forfeited God's love and therefore all the promises made to the Jews, and those promises devolved upon the Christians. And the Jews, then, the Christians then became the beloved of God, and the Jews were consigned to the party of the devil. That philosophy, that theology, was behind the great persecutions and massacres and pogroms of medieval Christian Europe. It went underground after the Holocaust for obvious reasons, and then it came roaring back in Britain, in the Anglican Church, in, I would say, the 80s, perhaps before. It was the 90s when I caught up with this, I think, late 90s, early 2000s. And basically what happened was this old calumny was revived courtesy of the Palestinian Christians based at the Sabeel Center here in Jerusalem. And they basically spliced together this old calumny with Palestinianism. So it was the Palestinians who had replaced the Jews in God's love, basically. And the Sabeel Center people, particularly a guy called Naim Atik, who was the leader of this thinking and this center, has been, or was for decades, a very close friend and ally of virtually all the senior bishops and archbishops, or certainly the senior archbishops, the senior people in the Church of England. And this calumny has just revived. And it is a very, very significant part now of the church. The church denies it completely. The church leadership denies it completely. But the church is full of the most appalling stuff. about Israel. I'll give you one small example, which is so telling. At Christmas time, many churches have a kind of tableau of the Nativity. Well, I think we've all seen them. You know, there may be little sculptures or big sculptures. Sometimes they're outside the church, sometimes they're inside the church, and we've all seen them. The nativity scene, the manger, the crib, the baby, Mary and Joseph, the three wise men, and usually a star. Okay? Right. So a few years ago, there was a wonderful item for sale on the internet. You could buy your own little nativity sculpture, or even a big one if you wanted. And there it was, the crib, the sheep, the wise men, the manger. And down the middle of the manger was a wall. That was the nativity. A wall, the separation barrier, down the middle of the manger where Jesus was born, the separation barrier. That encapsulates what the Church of England has become. It has spliced together this idea that the Jews killed Jesus with the idea that the Jews are now killing the Palestinians. And that's what they're preaching. Now, in godless Britain, people think that the church is of no consequence. And it's true that the majority of people are entirely secular and they don't go to church. Okay, fine. But that's not the point. The point is that the church helps set the tone of the society, because when bishops and archbishops speak, even though people are godless, they think he's a man of God and therefore he's basically somebody who's telling the truth. That's what they think. And also, you know, Western culture, if you're educated in Western culture, you are steeped in this rubbish the whole time. You're steeped in it from Chaucer onwards. Chaucer, Shakespeare, T.S. Eliot, you name it. They all hated the Jews. And so the more educated you are in Britain, the more vile you are. Because you've actually imbibed all this Christian-based hatred of Jews and Judaism. And so it's come roaring back. I think it is very significant, even in godless Britain. In America, it plays differently, because in America, you have scripturally faithful, biblically faithful Christians, many of whom love Jews. And we don't really have that in Britain, not to the same extent at all. So it's a different matter, it's a different situation. But generally, I think you are actually onto something.
I would add that the phenomenon that you described exists more with atheists in Europe, including in England, which is one of the highest, even though they had Brexit, but the population has a very high percentage of atheists and people of no religion, more than it does with Christians, because Christianity evolved. Yes, you know, centuries ago, replacement theology and the things that Melanie described and that you've alluded to were part and parcel of Christianity. But the church completely evolved and turned against it. And certainly in the United States, religious Christians are avid supporters of Jews from a theological point of view. But the atheists are stuck in some sort of arrested development when it comes to their religious faith, because, you know, remember that there's something that must be wrong with Jews, a zero-sum game, that if the Jew is stronger, I'm going to be weak. We really have two systems in the world. And I'm getting back to what I said earlier about this 21st century global philosophical divide is between Americanism and Europeanism, just like it was between communism and capitalism in the 20th century, and between monarchy and republicanism in the 19th century. Europe is a byproduct of the French Revolution. And we have to remember that the French Revolution is a rebellion against God, not against the church. And they try to change the 7-day week to 10 days just to negate the idea that God created the world. And the European democracy, and to some extent, even though it's indirect influences in the United Kingdom, is a byproduct of this this anti-God concept. While America was a rebellion against European dogmas. America was an exodus from Europeanism. The American Revolution was not just about, getting people to move from Europe to America. It was about emancipating from those European frame of minds, including the opposition to Judaism, the chronic opposition to Judaism that Theodor Herzl identified has been to Europe forever, and will stay in Europe and in Europeans forever. Americans rebelled against that. And therefore, as Melanie alluded to, American Christians are avid supporters of Israel, but also this is the essence of Americanism. America was established as a form of abstract Zionism, about the idea of a return. You have a lot of cities in the United States that are named Bethel, New Jerusalem, New Zion. And the founding fathers even considered Hebrew to be the language, the unifying language of the United States. So there is this, what I called in my previous book, Judaism 3.0, this alliance between Americanism, Zionism, and faith, because Israel is a deeply religious country in the sense that Israeli seculars are believers. We saw that in Yom Kippur, where a very high percentage of Israelis fast, over 90% observes the Passover Seder. Israelis are believers, Americans are believers, Europeans are not. And there is a chasm around there. And so I think the phenomenon that you've described, this sort of like core anti-Semitism and opposition to Judaism exist with those atheists in Europe and atheists. And sadly, there's, as I mentioned, Europeanism, American divide is not, the divide doesn't happen in the Atlantic Ocean. There is the European sphere of influence in the United States and vice versa. And there is a real, battle, legitimate battle in democracy in the United States. Are we going to maintain the values of the American Revolution, including the abstract Zionist values of the American Revolutions, or are we going to be Europeanized and go back to values that Melanie described earlier that are in contrast to the American Revolution? So I think the America, we can be critical of this policy, of that policy. We can be very critical, but the essence of Americanism is intertwined with the essence of Zionism. And sadly, the way that Europeanism evolved is in contrast to both Americanism and Zionism.
Okay, that's a nice wrapping up and bringing us back to the book. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming, for staying with us. Thank you so much, Gol Kalev and Melanie Phillips. I apologize I didn't get to everyone's questions. It may be our speakers will have time afterwards. Sorry, I can't now. It's getting very late. Thank you for joining us on Zoom as well. Those of you who are not on the mailing list that receive my emails of English events, please drop me an email, paulg@begincentre.org.il. American politics has come up more than once today. Our next event, which is not here at the Begin Center, but is a virtual on Zoom, a webinar. We're going to have a debate between representatives of the two major parties in the United States, debating before the election with obviously Israel and the Jewish community in mind. So that's on October 30th. So please do sign up for that. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.